You could live in the biggest war zone, but you could determine to be a man of peace. I've never hugged my father. I've never wanted to. I would describe myself as an African Caribbean who actually lived in England, passionate about people, passionate about justice, and passionate about culture, passionate about the gospel of Jesus. So I'm a Christian, I love Jesus, and I'm excited about my life. We're all impacted by what happens externally, but it plays out internally in our emotions, in our thinking, in our behavior, in our attitude, and in our perspective of life. I think the question about a black man hearing from his father, or would have liked to hear something from his father, it's a massive question. And I think the question needs time to unpack, because I think at times there's been so much gap within a black child's life in terms of his or her relationship with his or her father. And I think for myself, over the years, as I've thought about my relationship as a black man with my father, there were so many gaps. One of the questions that I asked myself as I was growing up and reflecting, is this normal? Is it normal that a black man don't tell his or her child that he loves them? Is it normal that a black man don't embrace their child and affirm them? Is it normal that a black man, even if they separate or leave their partner, don't stay in touch with his or her child? And I think for me, those are many of the questions that each one of them we could take time to unpack. I remember as a young child, I remember one occasion where I really had a laughter with my dad, and it was racing my dad in North London, racing him from one lamppost to the next. And that was such a highlight for me. And yet it was the only thing that I could remember that I thoroughly enjoyed. And I felt that was my father and I doing something together. Flip that coin over. And I remember the day when my father left my mother. Now, I was a young kid, I didn't understand everything, but I remember the day where I believe in my mind, my father stopped being a father to me. So there are all those questions, I think, are questions that had impact on me from the external, but played out in my thinking, in my behavior, in my attitude. Now, obviously, I'm not speaking for every black man in terms of their relationship with their father and their response. So we gotta, put that in first. But I've spent time over the years speaking to hundreds, perhaps thousands of men here in the United Kingdom, in Africa, and in the Caribbean. And one of the things, particularly for my generation, that as children, we were not able to articulate our feeling, articulate our concerns to our father. And even from my own experience, when I tried to speak to my father about some of my experience, it was as if he shut it down. I remember one day my father called me a boy. I was married, 2 children, and I said, "Dad, I'm a big man now." And he responded, You're still a boy to me. Don't go there. So I think that my father as a black man, myself as a young black man, that both of us missed out on some very important dialogue that we could have had together to understand each other, so that in later years our relationship and our bond could have been stronger, much stronger. I think in the context of a black father, we can learn as a black man how to nurture our children. When I think about my father's context, it was hard. The terrain was hard for him. It was brutal or brutally hard. But I think as I grew up, that there was a strong desire in my mind to learn. Now, although my father didn't cultivate or nurtured that desire to be a good father, an emotional father, an affectionate father, an open father, from books, from a desire, from listening, from being in the context with people who are showing it and talking about it, I learned something. I believe that any black man can learn, even if their natural father hasn't given it to them, they can learn to develop the art and the skill of nurturing their children. I laughed about the idea of me hugging my father, or the thought of it, or the response of my father, because it wasn't a thing that was done. I didn't see it. In fact, one of my reflections was I'd never seen my father hugging my mother. I've never heard my father telling my mother he loved her. I've never heard my dad saying that he loved me. Now, let me just qualify that, because one day my dad said to me over the phone, and he laughed, he said, I love you, I love you. But he was drunk. He was drunk. So he was under the influence of alcohol. And I noted, although something must have triggered him, and he said that, the only time he had said that, I knew what stuck in my mind, that he was under the influence of alcohol. So going back to your question about did that ever happen? No, it didn't. I've never hugged my father. I've never wanted to hug my father. And I suppose I couldn't really emphatically say that he wanted to hug me, but he had never indicated or showed any sign that he was emotional or affectionate enough to want to hug me as his son. My father's attitude did not influence me, because I made a conscious decision as a young boy that I want to be different. If ever I had children, I want to be different with them. So I was determined that from a young age that I wanted to tell my son that I love him. I wanted to hug him and kiss him. In fact, this morning, because I've just come back from the Caribbean yesterday, I saw my son. He spent the night in our home, and I hadn't seen him. We've spoken on FaceTime and all these things, social media. And we hugged up this morning. We hugged up. And he said, I've missed you. And I said, I miss you too. So I haven't learned that from my dad, but that's something I've been doing since my son was young. And when I was ill last year, he came and kissed me and blew some air down my neck. That's what I used to do to him when he was young. So it wasn't something that I learned from my father, but it just proved to you that you could take a bad situation as we think about it and be determined that that will not shape me. I refuse to be a victim of my own circumstances. And I think that's important. That's the mindset that we've got to develop, and that's the mindset I develop in relation to hugging, in relation to saying you love them or wanting to embrace my own children. I remember hearing this young man speaking, and I thought that was brilliant. He said, look at my environment, he said. It's a dump, he said. My environment is a mess, it's filthy, there's nothing good here. But he said this, I refuse to allow my environment, this negative environment, to influence me and to become a victim of it. And I want to say to young people, young men, young black men, I want to say quite clearly and powerfully over this interview, you could live in the biggest war zone, but you could determine to be a man of peace within that war zone. You could have had the most horrific thing happen to you or seen the most horrific thing. But you've got to say to yourself, I will not allow this to hinder my growth, my potential, my future, and my ability to become constructive in society. And I could say that because I've experienced that, but I've also witnessed this as I've traveled in different circumstances and contexts, and I've seen some horrific things over the years, and I've seen young men still come out and become a shining example within their community, within their nation, because they refuse to become a victim of their own circumstances. Life is not about money. Money is something we need to help us to buy food, to help us to do things that we want to do. It does make us happy for the moment, but it's not the be and end all of things. And I hear people talk about money, and I've got to remind them, money is something that we trade with. You know, when people didn't have money, they had bread, they had potatoes, they trade with something because they needed to live. And I would say to people, and it's interesting, the older I get, is the more I recognize and the more I come to terms with the fact that we spend all of our lives, most of our life, accumulating money. And some people accumulate a lot of it. And at the latter part of their life, they spend a lot of their time thinking, who am I going to leave this money to? What will they do with it? Will they squander it, or will they be wise with it? So we go for it, accumulate it, and then we spend a lot of time thinking about how do I get rid of it? Who's the best person? And I would say this about money. Treat money with respect. Don't love it. My mother used to say to me, if you earn £10, save 6. The more you seize, the more you want to spend. Save 6. She says to me, when you learn to save, you learn to honor your money. She also says to me, if you work hard and sweat, you would value that money and you'll make it go further. So when I see young men who say they want to sell drugs or live a life with crime, the answer to that is money comes easy, it goes easy. What advice would I give to young men about money? And it's live within your means. Live within your means. You know, my mother always said to me, and it was interesting because my mother said I thought they were quirky things, but actually they were very powerful. She says to me, if you want something, save for it and then buy it. So I grew up with the principle that my mortgage, that was long term because a lot of money, okay? If I buy a car, I will save some and I'll borrow some money from the bank. And if I take the money, borrow the money for 3 years, I usually pay it off in 18 months. And it was always about never get yourself into debt. Live within your means. If you can't afford it, leave it. Wait until you can. Put a priority on the things that we need, not the things that we want, the things that we need. But always ensure that there is enough money in the bank for rainy days or for events. So I would say very clearly, the debt that you need to have is a mortgage, because that's a big one. So if you're going to say I've got a big debt, it's just a mortgage. The second debt that you could have is for a vehicle, a necessity. And everything else, you save and you live within your means. If you do that, you will sleep well at night.
The love of God is great afar than tongue or pen can never tell. It goes beyond the highest star and reach to the lowest hell. The guilty pair bow down with care. God gave his son to